How's it going, everyone? BrainChild here, and today I'm going to be sharing some of my early impressions of the Pokemon Sword and Shield reveal trailer from a technical perspective, for those of you who are into that kind of thing. So you can think of this as sort of a preliminary analysis of the game's graphics at this point. Before we get started though, I should mention that the footage for this reveal trailer was probably taken from a very early build of the game, so we're not going to be able to draw any concrete conclusions about the technical aspects of this game's visuals, but I think it'll still be fun to see what we can discover about the game's visual design before it gets to the tail end of the development process later this year. And with that being said, let's get into it. So right off the bat, we're looking at a significant increase in scene complexity and composition compared to the previous Pokemon games. Relatively large expanse of hills and mountainous terrain. We got a decent amount of foliage peppered throughout the vista. Some of the color choices are really vibrant. The overall field of view really has been expanded to underscore the countryside aesthetic on display here. At the same time, technically speaking, I think we're looking at some assets that haven't quite made it through every stage of the art pipeline just yet. While I do expect the very distant level of detail assets to remain pretty low in detail in the final game, I'd say that most of the current assets, at least in this shot, have fairly low resolution textures or are just flat out unfinished, and the disclaimer at the bottom of the screen here seems to corroborate that. Also, YouTube compression isn't really doing this footage any favors, but compression isn't really the only problem that I'm seeing in the shot. Based on the apparent quality of a lot of the assets in this scene, I'm going to speculate that at this stage in the production pipeline, the developers probably just want to make sure that the game runs smoothly or smoothly enough to develop the general structure and layout of the game world, and optimizations to increase the fidelity of the assets while still running at an acceptable frame rate will probably come later in the year. Again, that's just speculation on my part based on the available evidence, but I do expect to see some visual improvements to scenes like this one as we progress later on throughout the year. Moving on. So this is a pretty nice shot. You got a good contrast between the foreground and the background by way of this shallow depth of field effect in order to highlight the subject of the focal point of the scene. Unfortunately, this particular implementation of the effect, known as Gaussian Blur, is pretty cheap and typically spills over into the boundary of the foreground, due to the limitations of its sampling method, which often causes halo or bloom-like artifacts to appear along the edges of the objects in the foreground, like we can see right here. I'm not the biggest fan of Gaussian Blur because I feel like it really misses the mark when it comes to conveying that granularity and distance between different parts of the background with respect to the foreground, and it just treats anything that's not the foreground as a single two-dimensional background layer that's smeared with Vaseline. But I suppose it gets the job done in terms of achieving a very basic shallow depth of field effect, so I don't think most people are going to have a problem with it. Okay, so my impressions of this shot are pretty mixed. On one hand, the scene composition has a lot of variety. There are a ton of trees littered along the horizon, which goes a long way in making sure that the countryside doesn't feel too barren. But the bloom on these crops is just ridiculous. Like, just why? It doesn't make any sense. Typically, you want to use bloom when attempting to emulate the artifacts produced by real-world cameras that convolve very bright parts of an image to the point where that light starts to bleed into darker parts of the image. But that would only make sense to do for parts of an image that have a plausible reason for appearing to be intensely bright in the first place, like a camera focusing on the sun shining through a small window of an otherwise dimly lit room, or a camera focusing on a strong specular highlight of a polished sword. But looking at the bloom in this image, the brightness is coming from field crops, so the effect is just completely implausible. Furthermore, the game in its current stage clearly has image quality problems, and adding bloom to the mix just makes matters worse. It's especially egregious in this case because field vegetation in most games doesn't cast shadows, let alone self-shadowing, so the vegetation tends to visually blend together instead of each blade or crop being visually distinct from one another, which is clearly a problem in this game, so reducing the clarity of the crops even more through the use of bloom just seems like bad visual design to me. Hopefully this is one of those things that they remove in the final version of the game, but who knows. Moving on. And here we go with the Specular Blooming again. No. There's nothing in these materials that would indicate that they're this reflective or emissive. They're not made out of water or glass or metal. They're not mirrors. I should not be seeing this much illumination coming off of these surfaces. It's like the developers just chewed up the laws of energy conservation and spit them all out over the Galar region. I can't. I will say though, the indirect and ambient occlusion visible here appears to be pretty good. Probably baked, but I'm impressed that a game with this style can convey the concept of indirect shading so well here. The variable degrees of illumination on the vegetation depending on how exposed the leaves are to the sun are also notable. You know, I find it interesting that materials like this backpack have Fresnel reflections even though the game engine's renderer defies the laws of physics and other aspects of its lighting model. We can also see some Fresnel along the edges of the character model as well, which is pretty nice. So far, the character design approach for the Pokemon trainers appears to be pretty consistent with the previous Pokemon entries. The visual appeal is pretty middling, I want to say, maybe even slightly generic. I do appreciate that the models have more realistic proportions with respect to their environments, though. This camera angle, though. Are they going with another fixed camera again? Please tell me they're not going with another fixed camera again. That would really undermine the exploratory element of this game's appeal when the environments seem to be so much more expansive than the ones from the previous games. I really hope we get full control over the camera this time. Lots of foliage in this scene, cool. I just wish the textures were cleaned up a bit, but this is a pretty good shot. It looks like there's a cube map reflection of the environment on the water's surface here. Albeit the environment render for the cube map is a lot less detailed and doesn't quite line up with the actual environment. Note how the cabin is missing in the reflection, for instance, but it's better than nothing. We can also see some basic shader-based ripples in the water, which is a lot less demanding on the hardware than using a complex tessellation system. Not as realistic, but that's okay for a game with this art style. The cutoff point for the directional shadow cascades is a bit too close, I feel. The whole point of a shadow cascade system is to optimize the use of shadow mapping by making shadows closer to the camera higher in resolution and shadows farther from the camera lower in resolution. And yet, these trees don't have any shadows, which makes them kind of look pretty bad. If Breath of the Wild, a computationally demanding open world game on the Switch, can handle low resolution shadow cascades at much farther distances, I fail to see how this game can't manage to do the same thing with presumably more computational resources to spare. Hopefully this is something that will be added when the game is released. Now this is one case where I'd say that lots of bloom is appropriate when using this art style. The glow here sort of serves as an approximation for in-scatter of participating media like fog. It's not true in-scatter among atmospheric particulate matter like in the real world, but the illusion works. Also, notice how the density of the fog appears to increase with distance to the point where the trees start to get swallowed up in it the farther they are away from the camera's point of view. I'd say this is the first shot I've seen so far in this trailer that is simply visually stunning. Kudos to the artist for doing such a good job with the scene. What's amazing to me about this shot is that there is less specular reflectivity in these metallic surfaces than the rooftops and flowers on some of the houses that we saw earlier in the trailer. Like, I'd love to sit down with one of the artists and ask them why they feel that flower petals should be searing my retinas with reflected or emitted light, but metals? No, that's just crossing the line. Now, to be fair, there does appear to be quite a bit of oxidation visible on these materials, as we can see with all of the rust here, but the irony here is pretty amazing. I do appreciate the directional shadows on the buildings, though. Not really sure why this shop appears to have a lacquered finish over it, but okay. I guess it kinda works with this art style. What doesn't work is this half-baked directional shadow implementation. The fence posts get shadows, but not the ropes in between them. Now obviously, if these assets were far in the distance, I wouldn't be complaining, but come on. I'm assuming this type of shading inconsistency has a lot to do with this being an early build of the game, so hopefully we'll see improvements in the final build. One thing that jumps out to me about this scene is how smooth the roundness of most of these arches are, which is either the result of a considerable amount of polygon subdivision or a considerable amount of polygons, period. Either way, smoothly round or curved edges of objects don't come cheap in the realm of computer graphics. So it's nice to see that the environments already have a sufficient amount of vertices, and the geometry overall is one aspect of the game's graphics that really seem to help the art style instead of hinder it. The normal maps and relief maps here are doing a pretty good job of giving the illusion of more depth in the terrain geometry than there actually is, so that's nice to see. Not a big fan of the snowflakes though, if we can even call them that. They look like they've been composited onto the scene as a post-process effect. I don't think that's how they're being rendered, but that's definitely how they look. I guess we can add that to the mountain of other changes to hopefully get tweaked by release. So, you know, this grass looks great. It would be awesome if the grass in the overworld had this kind of fidelity, but that's probably not going to happen. Oh well. Gee, I wonder what Pokemon this could possibly be. Surely I've never seen that silhouette before. Whoa, it's Pikachu. Who would have guessed? No, seriously though, Pikachu's looking pretty good here. Got some self-shadowing going on, a nice solid outline along the edges of the model, Some Fresnel reflections. Oh, okay, Pika. I saw you looking all distinguished like. Tell you what, you have your people call my people, we do lunch? Okay. Oh man, these ground textures are in serious need of some anisotropic filtering. Heck, I'd even take trilinear filtering at this point. Bilinear texture filtering is just not gonna cut it in a 3D video game in 2019. Yeah, there's no way the lots for these trees are gonna be this poor in the retail build of this game. Not a chance. I must say, the particle effects during the battle segments are looking pretty sweet. Very emissive and colorful, one of the better aspects of the game's graphics so far. Hold on, did y'all see that? Really? So the engine just gave up on giving the Pokeball a shadow. Okay. And why are the normal maps more detailed in the background than they are in the foreground? I'm starting to think that the engine's level of detail system is completely unoptimized at this point. And these tree textures, yeesh. Completely different lighting conditions in the environment, but the specular highlights on these Pokeballs are almost exactly the same. Okay. I swear I've seen this scene like 3 times now. Again, the particle effects, aces. The refractions during this particular effect are pretty sweet too. Not really physically accurate, but they look pretty cool. Okay, this motion blur here is pretty unsightly. There simply aren't enough iterations on the blur method to smoothen out the particles. Hopefully the devs are able to improve on this with the final version of the game. The animated sprites in the crowd look pretty good though, from what I can see anyway. Interior's looking pretty good, lots of asset variety, and the ambient occlusion is object specific, even if it's not super precise. Cool. This is a pretty festive looking scene, despite the confetti-like snowflakes. Most of these lights are probably baked, but I think the scene itself is well composed. Here's another scene where the environment appears to be using some type of parallax occlusion mapping or relief mapping technique to grant the illusion of more depth to the geometry. Not so sure it works so well here, as there appears to be quite a bit of aliasing, but this technique isn't very common for games on the Switch, so I'm a bit surprised to see it being used so liberally in a Pokemon game of all games. Pretty cool. The bloom on these lights are fine too, since they're, you know, actual lights and not flower petals and field crops. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but I think the cloud shadows are pretty well done in this game. I don't know if the clouds in the sky are actually casting these shadows, but I do appreciate the added detail nonetheless. I think this floor is partially reflective, but it's hard to say. Reflective of what is even harder to say. And here we go again with the Gaussian Blur bleeding. I suppose it's not so bad if we pretend that the Pokemon trainers have a faint aura surrounding them, waiting to be unleashed. Maybe the devs are huge fans of the Hunter x Hunter anime or something, I don't know. Gone, is that you? Well, that wraps up my early tech impressions of the Pokemon Sword and Shield reveal trailer. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and leave a comment below. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and notification bell while you're at it. Thanks for watching, and be sure to stay tuned to GameXplain for more coverage on all things gaming. Cheers!